I just want to say thank you for joining us and also welcome to Math Specialist Training and taking this next step towards your professional development. Tonight we're going to talk about revising a resource to improve alignment to the standards. So this is going to be your live webinar, and then the interim activity will follow this before I meet with you on April 12th. So most of you either did a hybrid training or you probably have been on a GoToMeeting, but I want to make sure you know where things are. So just a quick tutorial. Tonight, there's only a few of us on, so it'd be really great if when you want to give feedback or when you want to suggest an idea, if you could unmute yourself. The way you do that is by finding the green microphone button. If you don't have a microphone, that's okay, but you're just going to have fast fingers in the chat box. With only 4 of us, it would be really just simple to kind of unmute yourself at certain times and give your opinion, and I have no problem with that. Also, your control panel may look like the one on the left, or it may look like the one on the right. Depends on how yours is set up. If you want to make it look like the one on the left, you just click those expand buttons all the way on the right-hand side, and those will make it an expanded view. So if at any point you kind of lose your signal or you can't hear anything or you need to handle something within the platform, you can use that menu. You should also be able to see each of the people that are on tonight. And I thought this was a good opportunity. Typically, we kind of, we don't announce who's in our cohorts and things, but for our specialist cohort, we do kind of want you to have some contacts outside of your own program, which is kind of ironic because Ashanti and CJ, you guys are both from Safer Foundation, so that means you are from the same program, but I think you serve in different roles. So before we get too far, I think that some of us know each other and some of us don't. I'd like you to do a quick introduction. So if you have microphone capabilities, when I call your name, just go ahead and unmute yourself and tell us your name, where you're from. Some of us are in different locations, what kind of program you teach in, what's your role in that program, and anything else you want to tell us. And then there's only 4 of us, so this shouldn't take too long. So I'll start just at the top of the list. Ashanti, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and introducing yourself, please.
Hey, I'm Ashanti. I work for Safer Foundation, the PACE program. I am an instructional facilitator within the Cook County Jail.
All right. CJ, are you there? He might be trying to... CJ, we cannot hear you, so make sure you've unmuted yourself. And if you can't, just type in the chat box and let us know. I'm going to move on to Jennifer while you're figuring it out, CJ. Jennifer, could you tell us about yourself? Well?
Nope.
Oh, okay, CJ, now we can hear you, but I can't hear you, Jennifer.
All right, I found the button.
Well,
yes.
Thank goodness.
Okay.
So go ahead, CJ, while Jennifer figures out her button.
All right, CJ. I'm with, it's going to be kind of long, Safer Foundation with PACE Institute, which is part of Safer Foundation. I'm actually not in the jail teaching any longer. I'm actually at our satellite umbrella company, which is RTP, Reconstruction Technology Partners, where I do remediation for our electrical and our carpentry cohorts where I teach math.
Okay.
Yep.
And then thank you, CJ. Jennifer, did you figure it out? She says she's trying. Yeah, now I can hear you.
Oh, you can? Oh, okay.
Good.
I've never used this microphone before. Okay.
That's okay.
I'm Jennifer. I teach at Kankakee Community College. I teach math and all other subjects on the high school equivalency test as well.
All right. Well, thank you. We do have a few other participants as well from different areas. So when we come to a face-to-face training, you guys are going to meet other people. There's supposed to be one other on tonight, and then there's two, I think it's a total of four, let me do the math, right? Six, I think it's 6 people because we just had one drop. So I think it's 6 people in this cohort. If you're thinking, gosh, that sounds like a small amount, remember that the specialist track is generally kind of small. So or smaller, I should say, because not everyone is going to go on to be a specialist, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. Oh, there's my lovely animated arrows. This pathway should look familiar to you. At some point, you have a copy of this. Hopefully, it's stashed in your binder somewhere. But this is the point where you might want to pull it out, at least at some point during this training, and look at where you've come, right? Or where you've come from. You were a preferred instructor. Now you went through standards proficient training, all of you did, and then now you're on the specialist track. And so that's going to be your, well, technically 4th column from the left, right? And all of these criteria must be met. When you look at the pathway, we're going to talk about this a little more extensively when we meet face-to-face, but all of those criteria must be met in order for you to get the specialist credential, but you can work on any of those at any time. You do not have to do all of those things before the training. You can do them kind of out of order. It's just a matter of showing that you have done those things at some point. So we'll talk more about the details of that when we do our face-to-face training, but just as a reminder, this is the document that shows how each person is credentialed and also what the potential tasks and responsibilities are. So as a specialist, some of the things that you may be asked to do as part of your program, and some of you might have already been asked to do this, but now you can kind of throw that name in there and say, well, I am a content specialist, I am a math specialist, credentialed by ICCB. One of the things that you might do is curriculum work. So assisting curriculum development, evaluating appropriate materials, which is what we're going to focus on tonight. Develop appropriate content-related instructional materials. So develop your own appropriate materials. Also, maybe your role will be more in supporting instruction. Maybe if you have a mentoring program at your program, if you are going to teach other teachers how to analyze the alignment of a resource. Participate in peer mentoring or peer coaching. Provide observation and feedback on the integration of standards-based training. Our entire day 2 training is all about how to observe standards in action. What does it look like when standards are being implemented? And then the last part down there, programmatic development and support, you might be asked to participate on content area specific committees. This could be within your own program. This could be at a state level. This could be at an APC level. APC is your Area Planning Council. Supporting instructional staff through mentoring, observations, or further standards-based trainings, or even presenting information to your staff, and then also serving in an advisory capacity to ICCB as requested. Occasionally, we have a little bit of extra funds to do special projects with ICCB, obviously, within our own grant that allows us to pull in some of our specialists and work on these special projects. So, for instance, when a new book comes out in adult ed, maybe we'll pull together some specialists and work on a committee to analyze that resource. Or things we've done in the past have also included things like observing within a program, kind of bringing specialists in and doing that. And so these are just some of the things that you might be asked to do. This is very dependent on your administrator. So as to what you might be asked to do and to what degree. And this is also something we encourage you to present to your administrator as a strength, right? You've done this many PD hours, you've earned this, and now I want to stay in adult ed. Please, here's my credential, put me to work, show me what I can do for this program, because I want to not only be there to help my students, but also my fellow instructors. So tonight's webinar delves into just one piece of being a specialist, which is practicing revising a resource to improve alignment to the Illinois ABE ASE content standards. Specifically, we're going to take a look, we're going to be deepening our understanding of the standards in action, providing you with readily available resources that are aligned to the standards, increase buy-in for a curriculum aligned to the standards by involving you in the analysis process. I don't know about you, but when another instructor sends me a book or shows me something and says, this is really great, this worked really well for my students, I take that at much greater of a value than a publisher putting a book in my hands and saying, this is great for your students. Mainly just because I value my colleagues' opinion, especially if I know that they've been trained kind of the way I have, right? Or that we think alike and we teach alike. I think of they've found this great resource, I should explore it too. And so but the only way we do that is by actually looking at materials. And so sometimes that's the hardest part too, depending on where you teach, might limit the amount of materials that you have. The state went through a 2-year budget impasse, which impacted a lot of programs not being able to buy new resources or look at new materials. And now just recently, like even my own program at Elgin Community College, we just got an email that said, we have some funds to be able to purchase materials. What do you guys think? And I appreciate that as an instructor because I'm allowed to voice my opinion on what I would like to be able to use in my own program. Rather than kind of having, maybe the person who's doing the ordering do it, right? So what we're going to do tonight is analyze a lesson from this Core Skills math book. And we're going to specifically look at focus, standards for math practice, coherence, rigor, and notes to instructors. So focus, again, meaning laser line focus to the standards. How aligned is it? Standards for math practice. Those 8 math practices. And then coherence. How does it flow from one to the other? Which we're going to take a deeper look at coherence when we meet face to face. But for tonight, we will take a short look at coherence. Rigor. Does it have the rigor necessary for our students to master the content? And then also any other notes to instructors that you might use. I don't know about you, but generally I don't just hand a book to my colleague and kind of say, here, use this. There's always some sort of description, right? I liked this about it, I didn't like this about it. Or I found it's really helpful with this, but not so much with this, right? There's always a description. And so those kinds of notes can be really valuable for other instructors so that they don't kind of either waste their time or they know how best to use the resource. We are going to be using our critical friends model today. So just remembering that the things that we say and the things that we contribute to the conversation should be indispensable, important, and not judgmental. No one from New Readers Press is sitting on this meeting, but we should be kind of pretending that they are, right? And saying, this is what we like, this is what we don't, and here's why, and giving evidence to back that up. That's what this training is about, because there are some instructors at my program that if they handed me a book and said, I don't like this book, that I might look through it myself and form my own opinion. I probably do that anyway, just because of the type of person that I am. But if they specifically said, I don't like this, I might look at it, but I'm not going to look at it with probably as much time as if I had said, oh yeah, I found this really useful. You want to have evidence to back it up, though. If someone gives me a better description, I'm able to make a more informed decision. So what do you need in front of you? You should have the Core Skills math book in front of you. You don't have to have the copy of the lesson revision template. If you do, great. If you don't, there's going to be a copy on the screen, so you can follow along just with me. We're going to use a tool that we used in Standards Proficient training. This tool should look familiar, right? Remember, we used this for a teacher-made lesson. So we're going to use this same tool for a publisher-made lesson. And part of the reason that we do this is so that we know we're looking for the same thing. Whether a teacher made it or an admin made it or a publisher made it, we want you to be looking for the same thing. Focus, coherence, rigor, math practices, notes to other instructors, right? We want you looking for the same thing no matter whether it's publisher or it's like a personal teacher looking at it. So You should have reviewed pages 44 through 53. I'm going to give you just a few minutes to kind of get to that page in the book, refresh your memory. What is this all about in the book that's in front of you? And when you're ready to move on, since there's only 3 of you, I'm just going to just type in the chat, ready, right? Like I'm ready whenever everybody else is, okay? So go ahead and take a look at the All right. So now that you've kind of refreshed your memory on what these lessons are about, I just want to review a little bit about this book, first of all. It is a New Readers Press book. On the cover, it says pre-HSE, right? So meaning before they get to level 5, 6. If you were to look up the correlation of this material to the correlation chart that's on the New Readers Press website, they specifically say that this is aligned to CCR level D, as in dog, which is the same as NRS level 4. So hopefully you were kind of able to tell that from just the table of contents, right? That most of this is within NRS level 4 standards. This material, so meaning that this is the material that students need in level 4 before they get to that HSE level, right? They need to have a basis of this information. I specifically chose, when I was kind of trying to design this training, 2 lessons, as this book calls it, because if you were to just look at one lesson, I didn't feel like that gave us enough information to make some really good evidence-based opinions out of here. So I made sure to give you 2 lessons, which in this case we move from ratios and proportional relationships to percents, which is a pretty smooth transition, right? This book separates things into units. The units are related to domains within the standards, if you didn't catch that. And then each lesson within the unit is given a certain number of, like, there's different numbers of lessons within each unit. What I thought was interesting when I first looked at this book, I don't know if anybody else noticed this, but Unit 3, Operations and Algebraic Thinking, only has 1 lesson, which in my head, I think of NRS 4 as being such a more complex domain, than just interpreting and solving word problems. Now, you might say, oh, well, Amber, all the expressions and algebraic things are down below. Yes, I just thought it was interesting that there's more than 1 lesson for every other unit except that one. So what that makes me think of, being the trainer that I am, is, does that correlate to major work of the level, or MWADL, right? Do you remember that? How MWADL is how much time, gives us in a sense of how much time and attention we need to spend. So do these different domains, are they part of the MWADL or not? For instance, Unit 1 on numbers and operations, is that part of the MWADL within NRS 4? Should 7 lessons be dedicated to that within NRS 4? And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our face-to-face training. For tonight, we're going to talk about just the unit that I asked you to, which is Unit 2, Lesson 1 and 2. So you can also see in the beginning, they kind of tell you we have a pre-test and a post-test, which is like a lot of adult ed books, right? And here are some other things that are on, in this book, which are answer keys and vocabulary and skills tips and so on and so forth. So when we look at the actual lessons, one of the things that I am going to do is pull up a live doc. So I'm going to pull up this document, and it's somewhat filled in already. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's pretty filled in, but I want to have you guys talk more about each of these, because just because it's partly filled in doesn't mean that we can't add to it or that we can't modify it at all. So when we're filling this out for a publisher, that number 1 section of the lesson revision template is a little easier to fill out, right? It's the Core Skills in Mathematics book by New Readers Press, Unit 2, page 44 through 53. And I just told you that the intended instructional level of the lesson is NRS level 4. So we can fill that part out. And then a brief description of how the lesson should be used. It's kind of interesting because the book doesn't really give us a sense of how it should be used, right? It doesn't say this is review. It doesn't say that it is an intro. It just kind of puts it out there. So what did you guys think? You can either unmute yourself or put it in the chat box, whichever is fine with me. But what did you guys think about this lesson? Where would you put it, or where could you see it within that level with your students?
Amber, I think it's pretty spot on. Teaching, and a lot of this stuff is mainly what I teach in the classroom right now at that level, NRS level 4 and 5. So, yeah. So, I mean, from what I've seen, I agree with you with the, just the 1 lesson in the algebraic. What was it again?
Operations and algebraic thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel it could have been a little bit more there, but outside of that, I think that everything else was pretty spot on.
Okay. Do you feel like this is something you would use to fill in gaps with your students, CJ? This particular lesson. Let's say you figure out they don't have a, ratios and proportion kind of knowledge.
A specific one?
Yeah.
Actually, through reviewing it, it's I think I would specifically here because it gets to the point, but it's not overbearing like some books could be, you know, specifically, and not taking anything away from it, but like the Kaplan book,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think they get a little too, you know, they over explain, and for me, in a
Okay.
sense. Yeah.
Thanks. I tend to agree with you. There's got to be a balance, right? Which is exactly why this number 3 point is there. A brief description of how it should be used. With this book is very much, if every lesson is kind of set up in the same way, as they give a little bit of direct instruction or explanation, and then they do some examples, and then they give you some skills tips, which are like testing tips and little shortcuts. Then they give you some practice with some word problems, right? That's how every lesson is set up, which looks like a lot of other books that I know of, which tells me that it's not the be all end all, right? I can't just grab this book and assume that it's going to do everything for my students at this level, but it is pretty good at either kind of filling in the gaps, right? Hey, let's go over this. Let's make sure we're on the right page, or kind of a beginning lesson. You could use it as, let's do a little intro into this, and then, look at where your students are struggling, and then focus with maybe a supplemental text, right? To really drive the point home. So when we talk about suggested time, nothing about this publisher says, here's how much time you should spend on this lesson. Not a lot of publishers will actually put a designated amount of time, which I think is kind of ironic. If anyone's ever taught in K-12 world, there's a lot of things that have time on them in a lesson, right? But the other thing that I find different about K-12 published resources and adult ed is that adult ed are meant to be kind of independent practice books. They're a lot of them are, you read it, you look at the examples, you do the work, and you'll be successful. As opposed to, here's a book that a teacher can use, and here's the lesson to follow, then here's the independent practice, which is more like what K-12 books are. I'm not saying that, one is better, right? But for this idea of a lesson revision template, we would probably want something that the teacher could work from, not just simply something that the student could take home and kind of teach themselves the lesson. So what do you guys think about time? One of the big things that a lot of people bring up is that they would probably divide it in 2 sessions. They wouldn't be able to teach ratios and proportions and percents in the same session, whether that be an hour or 2 hours long. Do you guys tend to agree with that? What do you think about time?
Well, me personally, I always believe that time is relevant to the student and not so much as to the lesson.
Okay.
Because, I mean, example of today in class, I had, what was that? Oh my God, it's a long day. I forgot what I was teaching. Anywho, actually, I was going over polynomials today.
Okay.
And, one student was like, bam, right on it, figured out FOIL very quickly, whereas another student was like, can you do that again? And again?
Like it's a magic trick, right?
Right. So it for me, time is relevant to the student more than the lesson.
Sure.
And it always works for me. So I hope that answered your question.
Well, it did and it didn't, right? And I think that probably Ashanti and Jennifer would agree with you that depending on what you're teaching exactly, it could be relevant to the student. Here, we're looking for, if you were to hand this over to another instructor, how long would you tell them, hey, this takes about this long? And
Got you.
like,
Hi.
hi, Ashanti, what do you think?
So for this specific lesson, I think it could be all done in one session just because of how they can intertwine with one another.
Okay.
Sometimes when I haven't done it all in one day, then I'm spending even more time the next class bridging the gap in explaining how they relate to one another.
Mm.
Where sometimes when I do it all in one session, it's like, yes, it's like a spider web of information, but they're able to loosely connect it because they got it that day versus learning it and then having to reattach it to something else. So I've had more success doing it all in one day.
Okay.
Showing them how they connect at the same time as teaching it in my personal experience.
Sure. And I think that also depends on the approach, right? Like this idea of connecting ratios and proportions. I tell my students all the time that percent problems are proportion problems, right? That they shouldn't be separating those two things in their minds. You can solve every percent problem with a proportion. You don't have to, but you can, right? And so, Jennifer, did you have something to add?
Oh, yeah, that was my main, I guess, complaint about the lesson was I teach percents starting with using proportions.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't find it very valuable that they went from getting someone to understand proportions to then kind of dropping that and switching gears to something totally different for percents and how to solve them in a different formula for each scenario. That's not how I would teach it at all. So
yeah, and I tend to agree with you, Jennifer. When I teach this to my NRS 4 students, I see so many books that do this part to percent to whole, which is what you're doing in a proportion setup, right? But in a different equation, and teach this idea that if you're trying to find the part, then you multiply. If you're trying to find the whole, then you divide. And if you giving you these 3 different methods that go with 3 different situations. And the hardest part for students is deciphering which one to use. They know how to do the division. They know how to do the multiplication, right? They, at that point, usually, knock on wood, right? It has more to do with them being able to determine what are they looking for, the part, the whole, or the percent, and then what do they apply because of what they're looking for. So I completely agree with you, Jennifer. I also teach proportions first and then show them how that can be related to percents. And so when we're talking about suggested time, I think that, again, like you talked about, both of you, all of you kind of talked about, like you could do this in 2 sessions. You could do this in 1 session to make those connections between proportions and percents. So when we're talking about the learning goals, these are things that that I came up with about what are the learning goals for these 2 lessons. So here we have, look at a real world example that compares 2 different items and form and solve a proportion. That should probably say, I am a math teacher, not an English teacher. Compare 2 different items, form and solve a proportion. I will edit that later. Okay. Form a proportion equation having to do with unit rate. Define vocabulary, because there is a section in here about they need to know the ratio, the rate, a unit rate, and a proportion. And even on page 44 and 45, they talk about, 44 and 48, they talk about further vocabulary that the students need to know. Then you have apply percent procedures to real world problems, like calculating the tip of a bill, the percentage off an item, and that's where they get these skill practice questions, right? Where they're applying the percent procedures and then calculate the percent, part, and whole from a given problem. So these are, what you would present to students. If we were talking about these 2 lessons, here's what they're doing. This is a pretty comprehensive list, I feel like. What I want to show you, and if you want to interject because you think I'm missing something, please do. But what I want to talk more about is how do these learning goals connect to the standards, right? Because when we're looking for standards to go with these learning goals, a lot of times in adult ed worlds, you're not going to find books that have the standards in them. There are very few books. Actually, I can't think of one. If you have one, please send it to me, because I don't have a single adult ed book that says this lesson goes with blah, 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 blah standard, 4RP4. None of them do that. And once again, just to make the comparison, if you're like, well, yeah, Amber, none of them do that. In the K-12 world, they all do that. So if you've taught it all and if teaching is your background, they all do that. All the books say at the very top of the teacher's edition, it says, these standards are being addressed in this book. Now, to what length is a whole other topic, right? But even just identifying it doesn't happen in adult ed books. Because again, they're not intended necessarily for teachers to be teaching from. They're intended as kind of all-purpose independent practice books. So when we're talking about standards, most of the time with publishers, you have to go find them. And so what I did is I went on New Readers Press website. Now, most of them do have these. They're called correlation charts. I went on New Readers Press website, looked up where are the standards correlations for the book. You can do this with just about any adult ed book that you have in your arsenal or your library. You can go look up the correlation chart to see what standards it's aligned to. Now, if the book is more than 10 years old, you probably aren't going to find a correlation chart that's accurate because they probably haven't updated it. They'd rather update the book than update your correlation chart to your old book, if that makes sense. So, and that should be a clear-cut clue, say that 50 times fast, to you right away that, hey, if they don't even have a correlation to Illinois content standards or the CCR standards, should I be using this book? Is this book really covering the material that I'm supposed to be teaching my students? So a few of the standards that I determined, and a group of, I did this with another group of specialists as well, the standards that I found that correlated to these learning goals were the following. So I already identified whether they were model or not, and said, okay, for RP3 parts B and C, which involve using rate and ratio reasoning to solve real world and mathematical problems, including those involving unit price and constant speed. Also finding the percent of a quantity as a rate per 100, solving problems finding the whole given a part and a percent. So there's your percent integration, right? Then you have for RP4, compute unit rates associated with the ratios of fractions, including ratios of lengths, areas, and other quantities measured in like or different units. They do use different units throughout this lesson. I'm specifically even looking at just page 47, which talks about the scale on a map, inches and miles, having to do that conversion as a ratio. And then further down the page, they talk about they're using like meters, right? And then further down, we're talking about rate. How long does it take people to construct a kit house? One thing that I will say about this book, and you'll probably notice this as we look at more of it, there are a few things in here that I'm just a little unsure of as far as real world problems. For instance, what's a kit house? And maybe this is just me. Maybe I don't know what a kit house is. I can think of maybe what a kit house might be. Maybe like Habitat for Humanity when they all kind of come in, steps and you put it together, kind of like IKEA furniture. But if I don't know what a kit house is, how do you think my students know what a kit house is? I think some of the topics in here are a little unique or outdated. Please tell me if you know what a kit house is. Stop me and educate me, please. That, for reference, that's used on page 47. And not that impacts the way you solve the problem, right? Because you could just say to construct a house. It just sometimes makes students go, is this a real problem? This doesn't really exist. And just feeds into that whole idea that you're never going to have to do math in your life. The last standard that I found was for RP6, which was use proportional relationships to solve multi-step ratio and percent problems. These are the, 3-4 standards that I found that most closely relate, and all of them were model standards, which tells me this is super important for our students to know at this level because they're going to have to carry that through to the other levels. The things that I would be careful of are as you're looking at the lessons, are they rigorous enough to really be addressing these standards and each part of them? For instance, if I'm saying that there are unit rate problems involving unit price and constant speed, I would want to make sure that that's actually true. For instance, I believe there's a problem about a paint can, or is that a percent problem? I'm double checking. If you see it before I do, jump in. Where do you see unit pricing or constant speed problems? If you do, I'm having trouble remembering.
The paint can was a percent problem on page 50.
Oh, the paint can original price. So that's a unit price problem. But it's not unit price in the idea of, but that's not unit price, is it? Because that's percent problem. We're looking for unit pricing. So a ratio of either for, 1 ounce or 1 gallon or whatnot. Funny enough, I'm not seeing either of those. And as I express to my students all the time when I teach this, I say, you're gonna have that problem about constant speed. If a train is traveling this far at a constant speed, now what I do see, well, here you go. Take a look at page 52. It's the unit practice test. Now, what's interesting, they don't give a single example of constant speed problem in the previous lesson, but problem number 3 talks about constant speed. A cyclist on a long distance plans to cover the same distance each day. If he travels at 18 miles per hour, he'll cover the distance shown below in 2.25 hours. How many miles is it from point A to point B? So they haven't done a single constant speed problem in lesson 1, but they're expected to be able to do it in problem 3 and on the unit test. Now, part of me as a teacher says, well, yeah, the skills are transferable, right? But if you know adult ed students, the skills are not always transferable. They don't see it that way. And so a lot of times you have to present them with all the different types of problems that they're going to face. So one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this unit pricing and constant speed, signifying that this isn't currently covered in this particular book, right? Take a look at these other standards. Can you find evidence of these standards in these 2 lessons? I'll give you a few minutes to think about that. At just a surface glance, did you find any other discrepancies with these standards and what's in the book for these 2 lessons?
Well, I think for RP6, if they're saying to use proportional relationships to solve percent problems, again, that's something that they didn't even teach in lesson 2. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I don't really see how you could be showing that on a practice test if they haven't really taught you how to do it. And most of the ratio problems don't look like they're multi-step.
Mm-hmm.
At least I can't find one offhand that is.
Sure. What I noticed when I looked at that percent problems, multi-step percent problems, was that many of the percent problems, think I only see one that could be considered multi-step. Now, while you could consider the equation itself multi-step, right, that you have to do more than one step, when I think of multi-step problems, I think of you're finding either more than one answer or an answer that is dependent on more than one equation, right? And
Right, yeah.
for instance, when I look at page 51 on number 4, it talks about the table is comparing the field goal kicking. It shows how many attempts were made, according to these statistics, which player is the best field goal kicker. I mean, in there, they have to create the ratios, right? And then make a comparison. So you could probably consider that a multi-step problem, but it's one out of both lessons, right? And then if you're looking at some of the other practice test questions, they're a little more rigorous. They involve a little bit more, but they aren't really given an opportunity to see what that looks like within the examples. So what I'm going to write here is not present in lessons as is, present in practice test. I'm going to, instead of as is, it's content. Sorry, go ahead.
With 4 questions in a lesson review, how can you cover all of that? If there's like 3 pages of explanation, some of which doesn't seem to even come back up later. For example, when they're explaining how to, in lesson 1, about doing a fifth of a job or a third of a job, and I never see that come back up again. So I'm not even sure why they brought it up, unless I'm missing something.
Well, yeah, absolutely, because it's even hard to picture that problem, right? This idea of a fifth of a job, like who speaks like that, right? This idea of, I did 1/5 of the job today. No one says that. You would probably talk more likely in time, and then have to figure out the fraction for some reason, maybe time card or something. I don't know. But you're right. You're absolutely right. Having that 1/5 of the job over 30 hours and 1/3 of the job over 50 hours. And then they don't bring that back up. So why are it seems like there's a disconnect between some of the examples and then the skill practice. But like you said, Jennifer, you pointed out, how can you do a review with only 4 questions when you've presented, at least 4 different types of problems and you didn't connect the 2, right? So that's something we can add down here later, but I want to move us along. I want to be mindful of your time tonight too. Some of the standards for math practice that I found in here. Now here's the tricky part about this. Again, you're not going to find an adult ed book that identifies math practices in it. And it says, in this lesson, students are practicing blah, 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 blah. They're practicing reasoning abstractly and quantitatively. You're just not going to find it. You're lucky if the correlation chart even shows it, because publishers aren't just not finding a need to even do that work. So you kind of have to make some assumptions or make some leaps here. I think that when I was looking for evidence of math practices and I'm looking at those descriptions of math practice, these are the 3 I see. They have to attend to precision. That should say attend to. They do need to reason abstractly and quantitatively in the sense that they do have to contextualize and decontextualize. They have to take something that's in context, put it back into an equation or a setup, such as the percent problems, right? Even if you say, okay, I would teach it as a proportion, the way they teach it, you still have to know, what am I looking for? The part, the whole, the percent. Therefore, what method do I use? And then how is my answer going to be presented as a result? And then the other one is modeling with mathematics. I think that modeling with mathematics is a little bit of a stretch here, but a colleague mentioned to me that, even this idea of setting up a proportion or setting up different problems with different labels, that's modeling with mathematics, showing you can do the math in more than one way. Also, I'm already thinking ahead to the revision, and that's what this is. If I'm going to throw in model with mathematics, this gives me an opportunity to ask my students to show me the math in more than one way. And so when I go down here to my revisions, I can include that. some of the prerequisite or foundational content that students need, they need to have a basic knowledge of fractions, percent, multiplication, and division. Notice that they don't actually explain, excuse me for a second. Sorry about that. I don't know if you guys could hear that, but my dog started barking and I didn't want that to be in your ear. Because I am at home doing this webinar. So what was I saying? Students do have to have some idea of kind of what a percent is, right? At least know that it's per 100. They have to have that concept introduced to them at least before we jump into this. They also need to have fractions, multiplication, and division, basic knowledge. They need to be able to convert percents to decimals and vice versa, which again goes back to that idea of basic knowledge with percents. And then also rounding. I believe that was put on here because there's at least one question where they have to be able to round the answer to figure out what the exact total is, especially, and then even when you're using percents, right? If you get a certain percentage, you often have to round it to the next percentage up or down. When we're talking about coherence, how is this lesson related to other foundational content? And the things that I noted were things like slope, algebraic thinking, ratios, proportions, and percents can be part of those things. And those are both taught at an NRS level 4 level. So you are increasing their foundational content knowledge to then use it later when they're learning new topics. This is where I really want to say kind of what are we going to revise? Well, we would extend the lesson to include more word problems, varied examples given, including solving percent problems with a proportion. There it is, Jennifer. And that right there, just changing it from this idea of an equation, like a multiplication or division equation, to a proportion, already goes with my modeling with mathematics, right? And then some sort of bridge between lesson 1 and 2. And that kind of addresses what Ashanti was saying earlier, that she likes to include that bridge, right? And then also add concept of percent mini lesson, some sort of little like, hey, this is what a percent is. The other thing that I want to put here, because you guys, especially Jennifer noted this, was they don't use proportional relationships and there aren't many multi-step ratio and percent problems. So I'm also going to put extend the lesson to include multi-step problems involving ratios and percents. The notes to instructors, goodness gracious. Oh, it just doesn't like that. The notes to instructors here, this is the section where we would want to tell people, what would we need to add? Is there any additional clarifications that we want to make? For instance, something like what Jennifer said earlier about, well, I would teach it with proportions, that could go here, right? This idea that you can teach this in more than one way, and one way might be better. The idea Shanti brought up earlier about connecting or bridging the two concepts, that they are sisters or cousins, or however you want to make that analogy. That is what, that is how they're connected, and then therefore how they're used. So doing a lesson revision template like this, depending on what book you're using, could be more lengthy than what you would do with an instructor-made lesson, or it could be less lengthy. It really depends. This was kind of done as a webinar tonight, and I will make this available on the Canvas site. So when you go to your Canvas site, you should be able to see webinar materials and resources. If you click there, after tonight, because I'm going to do it tonight, you should be able to see all the information that we did together so that you can refer back to it. And part of the reason I want you to refer back to it is for your next activity. So let me get there. Before I move on too far, are there any questions about what we talked about tonight? like that, this whole lesson revision process? You thinking, Amber? You have my attention for 2 more minutes. Well, if you are thinking about this and you do have questions, just let me know. You can always ask me questions through Canvas or through email. I'd be happy to talk with you on the phone too, if that's how you prefer. But when we're talking about the lesson revision process, this should be kind of a review. And that's kind of why we do it first too, is this idea of when we take one lesson and we revise it, what does that look like? We want to make sure that we're aligning it to the standards, to the math practices. We're addressing components of rigor, coherence, and focus. So your homework involves doing this, replicating this activity. So you have 2 pieces to your interim activity. You are going to complete a lesson revision template for your assigned lesson and submit it through Canvas. So on the left, and again, this will be in Canvas, so you'll have access to this as well, but you should find your name and write down which lesson you're being assigned to. This really helps us in our next training because we're going to look at this resource as a whole in our next training. So I want you to do what we did tonight, or what I did tonight, where I made a lesson revision template. I identified the standards. I identified the model. I looked at math practices. I then made revisions based on what I found. And then, and each person is assigned to a certain unit and lesson. This is due on a certain date. Between that date and our actual face-to-face meeting, I want you to go and look at other cohort participants' work. I'm not asking you to comment on it. I'm not asking you to critique it. I just want you to be familiar with it. Why? Because we're going to come together as a working group on our face-to-face day. We have 3 hours to do a good amount of work and training, and I want to make sure that everyone is prepared as possible. So one way to do that is by kind of looking at what everybody else did. So you're going to get an email announcement from Canvas that details the interim activity with the lesson revision template document in digital form. Your due date for that is April 5th. So you've got a few weeks to get that done, to get this assignment done for your assigned lesson. Between April 5th and April 12th, which gives you about a week or so, is when I want you to go onto Canvas and look at the peer reviews. And I'll send you a reminder like, hey, remember, you have to look at the peer reviews. You can comment if you'd like to. You don't have to. But what I really want you to do is come in very prepared for our face-to-face training, knowing a lot of this resource, or because you've looked at what your peers have done. By no means am I asking you to revise this entire book. That's why we have specialist working groups. I'm asking you to come in well-versed with this book and what other people found so that we can do a more comprehensive analysis of the entire book. So again, all the information you'll need is in that Canvas. Remember, we're meeting at Waubonsie Community College, the Aurora campus. They do have more than one campus, so make sure you're going to the Aurora campus. I will have a defined address for you in the coming weeks, as well as a building location. They have not given us that building and room number yet. So once I have that information will get put up in Canvas, and then an announcement will go out. Usually, if you remember, usually the week of the training, I always send out a, hey, this is where you're going. This is when you should be there. Or this is when we're going till, and so on and so forth. But it is on April 12th, and it is in the afternoon. So plan accordingly, because that is our next face-to-face. So, CJ, I do have one thing for you that I thought of while I was sitting here. It's kind of unrelated to specialist training, but when the